The ghostly captive. Susan was 21, and she was a single mom, with a lovely baby girl called Charlie. The father of the child had left them for another woman when she was 6 months pregnant, and he had left the town to go and live in the West Country, and she had heard no more from him ever since. To tell the truth, she was glad to be rid of him, because he was a waster and a scallywag, and was always getting into trouble. She had been living in a bedsit for 2 years on benefits, and she finally got the news that she had been waiting for. She had been given a 2-bedroom flat in Pilkington, which was a small town, just 15 miles up the road from where she lived, and she was over the moon about it. It meant that she would be away from her friends, because she didn't drive, or even own a car, but the sacrifices were worth it. She figured that she could visit her friends by getting the bus from time to catch up on the local gossip and also do some shopping at the mall. She grabbed her daughter and exited her room and knocked on the room next door to tell Donna about her good news and to ask her if she would look after Charlie while she picked up the keys and then went by bus to Pilkington to see if she wanted the flat. Donna was ambivalent in that she was pleased that she was finally off the waiting list and had landed a council flat, but was also upset because it meant that she would be losing a close friend that she had known for 18 months. However, she pushed her negative feelings down, forced an enigmatic smile, and said that she would babysit while she sorted things out. Susan hugged and kissed her, and she left immediately for the council office to pick up the keys. She picked them up and was on the bus to what would be hopefully her new town, and she was excited throughout the journey. The miles sailed by, and before she knew it she was in her new town. She got off at the old village, which was situated in the center of the town, and it was a short walk from there to her new flat. She knew that she would be given the keys, directions and a map of the area by the council, for they had already came to that arrangement over the phone when she had rung them after receiving their letter in the post that morning. Initially, they had told her that they could not drive her out there that day because they were overrun with work and they had no one spare to take her there until the next day. However, Susan was too excited to wait, and she had persuaded them to give her the keys and the directions that day so she could view it on her own. So after they agreed, she went to the office to pick them up, and then off she went to view her potential abode. As soon as she had got the keys, she knew that she wanted it, because she had a good feeling in the pit of her stomach. She did not know if it was the anticipation that you get just before you open up your presents on Christmas morning, or if it was intuition, but whatever the reason, she was feeling in her gut both optimistic and positive. She found the estate with no problem, and it seemed like time had stood still as she was letting herself into her new home. She loved the place as soon as she had entered it. I mean, it needed a little bit of work, but she was an excellent decorator. She saw herself as a budding interior designer, and she was looking forward to the challenge. She moved in the following week with the money that she had acquired from a grant from the benefits office. It was in no time at all that she had redecorated and furnished her new flat, and she was settled in and was comfortable. She loved the area because there was a shop just on the corner of the estate where she could get her shopping at a reasonable price, and there was a local nursery and school just down the road where she could take her child when the time came. Charlie was 2.5 at the moment, but it would not be long before she would have to take her to the nursery to begin her schooling. As the months rolled by, she became friendly with 2 of her neighbors. Sandra, who was a single mum like herself, and Julie, who had 3 children, was in a relationship and was waiting for a house to come up on the waiting list at the council because they needed a larger and more appropriate property to accommodate them. She was closer to Sandra because they had a lot in common in that they were both single mums and their children were of a similar age. Josh was 2 months older than Charlie, and they got on like a house on fire right from the offset. Julie and her family moved out into a brand new house in the fall, and that was the last that Susan saw or heard of them, even though they had promised that they would keep in touch. Sandra and Susan came to the arrangement that they could take turns babysitting for the other while they went on the prowl looking for a man down the local boozer to help fill the hole that was in their hearts and lives, and it was only 3 weeks later that they had both met someone. Although Sandra was more casual about the new man in her life, Susan was bowled over by her catch, whose name was Stephen, who was a plumber, and it was at Christmas, while they were opening their presents, that she gave him a key to her flat and told him that he could move in and join her family. He happily accepted and moved in on New Year's Day. It was after a few weeks of Stephen moving in that a string of paranormal events began to happen, and it began when Susan was having a shower. She knew that she was on her own, because Stephen was at work. Yes, she was alone except her child Charlie, who was asleep in her bed. Yes, it was when she was taking her shower that she had the strange sensation that somebody was in the bathroom watching her. She got goosebumps on her skin even though the water was hot. She felt anxiety in her stomach, and she thought that she saw someone standing in front of the shower glass watching her. She opened up the shower door and cautiously peeked out to have a better look. She thought that someone had broken into her home, and she was in fear of being attacked. However, when she gingerly stepped out of the shower to confront the intruder, there was no one there to be seen. She thought that her mind was playing tricks on her, so she stepped back into the shower and carried on having a wash. After her shower, she had turned off the water and was at the sink brushing her teeth, when she thought that she heard a deep guttural growl, and then suddenly the shower turned itself back on, and she was startled and petrified. She went over to the shower, opened up the door, and turned the water off, and stood there for a while gaining her composure and grasping her sanity at what had happened. She dismissed it as being her imagination, and went back to the sink and continued brushing her teeth. She looked around at the shower again halfway through brushing, half expecting it to turn itself on, when she noticed some writing in the steam on the glass, and it read Trevor. This totally freaked her out, and she began to lose the plot. She turned around to spit the toothpaste into the sink, and as she did she looked at the writing reflected in the mirror above the sink, and it read Robert. She filled her mouth with water and gargled and spat it into the sink to rinse her mouth out as fast as she could muster, and then after she had finished she heard that deep guttural growl once more, and the lights began to flicker on and off. She walked over to the bathroom door and tried to open it, but to her horror and dismay the door would not open no matter how hard she tried, even though it was not locked. She persisted as she pulled and screamed in panic as her thoughts went to her child and her safety. She screamed out, "God give me strength," and the door suddenly sprang open, as if it were opened by some kind of invisible yet powerful force. She ran out of the bathroom and into the child's bedroom to see if she was safe, but Charlie was asleep in her bed, totally oblivious as to what had been going on, and then the lights went back to normal as if nothing had happened. By the end of the day, when her boyfriend had come home from work, it all seemed a little surreal. However, she casually mentioned it to him, but he was a skeptic and suggested that there was probably a rational explanation. She grappled with his logic at first, but eventually saw it his way as he embraced her in his warm, loving, safe arms, and she put the event out of her mind. It was some weeks later, when they were in bed in the middle of the night, that she heard footsteps in the hallway. Half asleep, she climbed out of her slumber and went to check to see if Charlie was sleepwalking again. She had been doing this ever since Stephen had moved in. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty, and it was then that she felt a cold breeze brush by her from behind, and she felt a sharp, forceful thrust in the small of her back that almost sent her careering forward. It was then that the room seemed to drop in temperature, and she instinctively cradled and rubbed her arms up and down and around her torso to get warm. She could visibly see her breath exiting her mouth as she exhaled. She steadied herself and regained her composure, and then she heard footsteps traveling down the hall. She thought that she saw a tall, dark, shadowy figure walk through the kitchen door and disappear out of sight. Subsequently, she heard the sound of plates smashing, and although she was terrified, she ran towards the kitchen to witness the event. She rushed toward the noise, dispelling the scary incidents from her mind, and her mind went back to her child sleepwalking, and she thought that her daughter had dropped the plates in her somnambulistic state of consciousness, unaware at what she was doing. However, when she got to the kitchen door, the smashing sound ceased, and when she opened it, her daughter was nowhere to be seen. There was no sign of any broken crockery on the floor, and on top of that, all the cupboards were shut and the dishes were safely put away where she had placed them earlier, after she had washed and dried them after dinner. She felt a chill run down her spine, and the hairs stood up at the back of her neck, and the goosebumps rose on her skin, and she shuddered with fright when she heard a distinctive male voice ominously call out her name. She shut the kitchen door in fear, terrified at the night's events, hoping beyond hope that it was her mind playing tricks on her. She tried to snap herself out of it for the sake of her family and her own sanity, and then she went to check on her child, and when she got into her room, she was babbling to what appeared to be an imaginary friend, and she thought to herself, "Isn't she a bit young to have an imaginary friend?" However, she was clearly talking to someone and there was no one there. She brushed the confusion of an imaginary friend aside, and then she bent over and picked up her child and went back to her room, frightened and confused by the incident. No matter how hard she tried, she could not get the haunting out of her mind, and so she woke her boyfriend up and told him about her experience. He suggested that she was probably half asleep and dreaming it all up, but she was not totally convinced by his explanation. However, she eventually felt secure, and she drifted back off to sleep after she had put Charlie back in her room and had sat with her until she was sound asleep first. When she got up in the morning to make breakfast, she got out of bed and strolled down the hallway into the kitchen, and then she noticed all the cupboards and drawers were open. That startled her, and she let out a blood-curdling yelp in her surprise. She frantically ran off to get help from her partner, who was gradually getting himself out of their bed to have a shower before breakfast, when she heard the television turn itself on in the living room. She screamed in panic and rushed toward the bedroom, and she screamed out at what had happened. She asked Stephen to explain it with logic. They both went into the sitting room and turned the television off, and then went into the kitchen and shut the cupboard doors. Seeing that there was no logical explanation, Stephen dropped his skepticism and suggested that they should get a spirit board and hold a seance, and see if they could communicate with the troubled spirit that was obviously haunting their flat. That night, when Stephen returned after work, he had in his possession a spirit board, which he said that he had picked up from a New Age shop in his dinner hour. He said that he had told some of his work colleagues about their ghostly events and ongoing situation, and that they had pulled his leg about it all day by humming the Outer Limits theme tune. They had dinner and they put Charlie to bed after they had let her play with her dolls for a few hours, and then they retrieved the spirit board from the cupboard where they had placed it earlier to keep it out of sight from the child. They had invited Sandra around to participate and take notes as the seance was taking place to make sense of it, and she had agreed. She had asked her mother to come to her flat and babysit while she spent some time with her friends next door. She did not tell her mother the whole truth, because she was wary of dabbling into the occult. They all sat around the kitchen table and performed the seance, and they immediately made contact. The spirit that came through said that she was Susan's late Aunt Emily, and that she was watching over Charlie to protect her from any harm. Susan's mind immediately went back to her child's imaginary friend, and she asked if she was that imaginary friend that she had seen her daughter talking to, and Emily confirmed her suspicions. This took Susan aback. However, She was not in fear of her child's safety, as she felt that her aunt was telling the truth, and that she was benevolent in life and would therefore be that way in the afterlife. So she felt sure that she was protecting her child from any kind of harm or danger. Then another spirit came through, and it was a male, and he said that his name was Robert, and that he lived there in their flat, and it was them who were invading his home, and that he wanted them out. Susan remembered the writing that she had seen in the mirror from the shower, and she told the others about it, which confirmed her story and the authenticity that Robert was real and communicating with them through the spirit board. He got quite abusive, and he began to threaten them by saying that he would cause them harm. They were all scared by this, and they brought the seance to an abrupt end. The next day Stephen took the spirit board out to the dustbin, and he threw it away, and they all decided that they would put the paranormal events out of their minds and get on with their daily business. However, that evening as they were getting ready for bed, they found the board on top of the sitting room sideboard, and they were both taken aback. At first, they both simultaneously accused each other of having brought it back into the flat. Then, having reached the conclusion that neither of them had done this, they destroyed it and took it back out to the trash, ready to be taken away by the dustmen who were due the next morning. That night the bedclothes were snatched off them while they slept, and their bed shook and moved back and forth by some unseen evil force. It was accompanied by some heavy breathing, and they were both distraught. The horror did not end there, as Stephen suddenly felt a great weight upon him, and it started to throttle him. As much as he tried to struggle and get away, the worse it seemed to get. Then, just after he thought that he was going to pass out and be strangled to death, the grip from his neck diminished and eventually ceased, and he was free from the harmful apparition's fatal clutch. They both laid in bed for a while after that, paralyzed with fear. Then when the fear subsided, they thought of Charlie, and they went and checked on her, but she was sound asleep. They went back to their room, and they kept the light on for the rest of the night as they lay in their bed, and they both decided there and then to seek the help of an expert the following day from the internet, or the mind-body-spirit ads in the local newspaper. A week had gone by, and the negative energy had begun to build and build, culminating in a prolific amount of paranormal activities. It was as if the entity was getting its kicks out of scaring them. It was like it felt like it was in control when it caused the spiritual anomalies to occur. As each day passed, they struggled to keep themselves together. They had often felt a heaviness in the air, and they found it difficult to breathe. The picture frames had been tossed around the rooms, some hurling off of the walls where they had been nailed on. The chairs in the kitchen had been flipped over and were scattered all over the floor. The lights had constantly began to flicker on and off, and they had both seen a dark, shadowy figure ominously walking around their flat. That was the least of their problems, though, because not only had the spectre been visiting and even attacking them at night by shaking their bed, and even attempted to throttle them to death in their sleep, it had also managed to possess Stephen. He had been sitting in the armchair passively watching television, when suddenly he stood up and started hurling a string of obscenities and profanities at everyone who was present, which were Susan, his next-door neighbors, and his parents. Everybody was shocked and petrified by his uncharacteristic evil outburst, and you could cut the atmosphere in the room with a knife. What made it even more threatening was that a malevolent glare that seemed to possess and take over him had emanated from his countenance as he was hurling the abuse. He growled like a wild, evil-spirited beast, and he cursed in a deep demonic voice and frothed through his snarling, tormented lips. It went on for about 10 minutes or more, and then he finally collapsed back into his chair, seemingly unaware of what had just taken place. Everyone who was present were gripped and terrified with fear, as if in a collective hive mind, by his tumultuous, malicious and devilish outbursts. Finally, as the week had come to an end, a paranormal research team of 3 men and a woman came up to investigate the flat, and they were left on their own in complete lockdown, with their equipment set up and running for the night, while Susan and her family stayed at Stephen's mother's house that lived nearby. They had a digital camera on a tripod stand, video and infrared cameras, EMF equipment, electromagnetic field meters, movement detectors, and EVP equipment, electromagnetic voice phenomenon, set up and running all around the flat to detect the paranormal activity, if there were any to be sought. The next morning, they left with their equipment, and a week later Susan and Stephen visited their office to see if there were any results, as had been agreed over the phone, when they had decided to take the case. The paranormal team said that the temperature had dropped several times throughout the evening, and that they had caught some spectral pictures on their camera of which they took snapshots of and around various places in the flat. A chill ran down their spines and fear and anxiety erupted in the pits of their stomachs, accompanied by the hairs standing up on their necks and a breakout of goosebumps on their flesh, because they also got a clear view of a ghostly image and several orbs. There was also a vivid picture of a shadowy figure on their video recorder that was displayed on their computer monitor of which it was connected, which was on their office desk for them to view. However, the most amazing evidence was the conscious EVP recording that they had acquired. They said that there were two different types of EVPs, and one was just energy, or residue left over from something traumatic in the past, like a recording, and the other was alive, intelligent, or conscious. Basically, they could ask questions and get a response to the questions on their equipment, of which they did, and they had clear recordings of the conversation of a disembodied entity whose name was Robert, and a deep growling voice that sounded like that of a ferocious animal or something not human. They played them the EVP recordings, which they also had set up on a computer displaying the sound waves visually on the monitor screen, and they asked several questions of what Robert wanted. He replied that he wanted them to leave, to just go away, were his exact words. He said that he was unhappy and angry, and he wanted to be left alone. The demonic growl that followed was random, spontaneous, and incomprehensible. The paranormal team said that they had overwhelming evidence that their flat was haunted, and that the ghost that they had conversed with was unhappy, and that he was not alone, as their equipment had detected more apparitions in their flat. There was also the growl, which could have been either a deceased animal or a demonic entity, which could correlate or be connected to the shadowy figure that they had previously caught on their cameras. Nonetheless, they could not get rid of them or cleanse the place, for their job was just to observe and confirm if their place was actually haunted. However, they said that they knew of a good psychic medium and healer who could cast out or help to cross over the trapped souls and cleanse their place of residence. The healer was a psychic medium that used an eclectic range of spiritual techniques and procedures to help rid homes of ghosts and demons, and they were sure that if they got in touch with him, that the ghostly happenings would cease. The team gave them his telephone number and wished them good luck, and Susan and Stephen thanked them and then said goodbye as they left. They got in touch with the psychic medium through the phone number the next day, and he came to their aid with a female assistant 2 days after getting in contact with him. They put Charlie next door out of harm's way with Sandra for the night, while the spiritual proceedings took place. The psychic medium and his aide sprinkled salt across the borders of the flat, in between doorways and across the windowsills, and they laid healing crystals strategically about the flat, and some lighted white candles in each room, to help the lost souls find peace if and when they made contact. They also lit a small circle of candles on the living room floor, and they burned incense in a burner in the ring center. Then they got everyone to form a magic circle around it, where they joined hands in a spiritual meditation for invocation, where they called upon the four winds and the guardians to initiate the ceremony and to give them help and protection. Next, they were told to chant "Let there be love, peace, joy, wisdom and light" to protect and to guide them throughout the ceremony. After that, they called upon God to send down love and light, and to give them further protection from evil. After they had completed their tasks, the medium reached out with his spiritual senses and scanned the place to see if there were any malevolent spirits lurking around waiting to cause mischief or mayhem within the surrounding area. The medium was able to disassociate from his physical body, allowing spirits or entities into his being, and then the helper could communicate with them through him to help them cross over. The medium explained that sometimes when a death is sudden or tragic, that the spirits become lost or confused and they wander in between dimensions, not actually knowing that they were dead or how to cross over. It was then explained that both the helper and he could help them to obtain lucidity, and then convince them that they should leave this dimension behind and make the crossing into the light, where their post-mortal friends and relatives were ready and waiting to greet them into greener pastures when they eventually and successfully make their journey. The medium then went into trance, and he immediately made contact with Emily, and she reinforced what she had wrote on the spirit board. She said that she was only visiting the flat to protect the child from any harm that the evil spirits that were also present could cause, and that she would return to the light when the evil spirits had vacated the premises. When she had finished speaking, she moved aside, and suddenly the atmosphere instantly began to change. It became heavy and oppressive, and they could all feel rage enter the room. The atmosphere in the room changed again, and there was an emptiness and a deep sad feeling that seemed to dominate the vicinity, and it was then that the psychic healer picked up the vibration of a middle-aged man that he felt had had a hard time coping with the pressures that came hand in hand with his active combative memories and traumas that he had been engaged in the Suez crises of '56 while he was alive. On top of that, he had returned to a life of hardship and depression, accompanied with his daily anxiety, uncontrollable stress, and night terrors, which had driven him to the bottle. He had lost his family to all the psychological chaos and torment, and, because he had become a self-piteous, selfish and abusive alcoholic, he was impossible to be around, let alone live with or try to raise a family with. Him and his wife had eventually broken up, and had decided to go their separate ways. Yes, he had had a wife and a daughter, and Susan, Stephen and Charlie had reminded him of the happiness that he had lost, especially when Stephen moved in as they forged their new family together. This made him angry, which brought up a plethora of unwanted deep-seated negative feelings and emotions, which made him want to scare, hurt and even kill them to wipe away his own guilt and suffering. He had taken his life way back in the mid-1970s, tormented with sorrow and guilt at what he had done. Robert the trapped spirit was, as had been confirmed by the paranormal team, their own experiences, and now through the medium, haunting their flat. He was very angry at them living there, and he would do anything in his ghostly power to get them to go away, and leave him on his own to wallow in his sorrow, melancholy, and self-pity, even if it meant killing them all. Yes, he had truly become a twisted, vindictive and demonic monster, a ghostly captive riddled with self-torture, anguish, shame and despair that was haunting them, and at the same time was haunted from his own tormented past. The ghost possessed the healer, and abrasions instantly appeared on his body and arms, but the healer carried on with his psychic connection stoically and unperturbed. Furniture and other smaller objects began to get thrown around, and it all got a little scary and unsafe to be there, but they all knuckled down and got on with the cleansing. The room grew noticeably colder, and a foul, nauseous smell filled the air, and everyone except the healer began to choke, but the medium carried on. The smell that was causing the choking gradually subsided, and everyone recovered from their asphyxiation from the stench. The furniture and objects became dormant too, and the room fell silent as the helper began to converse with the trapped spirit that was now tired and broken, but still possessing the spiritual medium, who was now in a trance. She told him that it was not his fault that everything had turned out the way that it had, that he should stop torturing himself and let go of his negative feelings and emotions. She said that he no longer belonged in this world, and that he should cross over where he would fit in, and that was in the light. It took what seemed to be several hours to convince the ghost to let go and cross over, although it was hard to say how long it had actually taken, because time seemed to have stopped in all the terror and confusion. There seemed to be someone or something else other than his depression and guilt that was controlling him and keeping him captive. But eventually, he did cross over, after the helper explained to him that whomever, or whatever, it was that was holding him back, had no power over him at his making the crossing. She told him that he should fight it and let go, because his family was on the other side of the veil waiting for his arrival, for they had both crossed over, and have forgiven him, when they were involved in a fatal collision, in an automobile accident in the early 1980s, and had gone to the light. Then, after the ghost was gone, the healer became aware of a deeper, darker presence. He sensed that it was demonic, and it was this demon that was holding Robert in the flat, because it wallowed in his endless suffering, self-pity and insurmountable guilt. He believed it had probably even been the catalyst that steered Robert into drink, his broken marriage and eventually his suicide, and it had bathed in his torment when he had become stuck in between worlds, before he had fought back, and had eventually made the crossing to rejoin his long-lost family. He sensed that the demon had been summoned and invited to stay there by a tenant, who performed dark rituals before Robert and his family had moved in. The medium asked his guide to elucidate at how the demon had come to be there, and the guide explained that in the early 1930s, George, who was the tenant of the flat, at that time was on the way to the off-license, when he bumped into his friend Kevin. He noticed that he was troubled, so he asked him what was troubling him, and he replied that a young friend of his was going to be attacked by an older man, and that he wanted to stop it. George told him to turn up with his young friend, and give the bully a taste of his own medicine. He retorted by saying that he did not have the confidence to pull off that kind of stunt, and he asked if there could be another way, perhaps with witchcraft. I do not know a lot about it, however. I have thought about dabbling into the occult, as I have been inspired by some research that I have done on the subject, he replied, so I could try to conjure up a demon and set it upon the bully. Kevin's face lit up with enthusiasm. He asked him if he had anything that belonged to him, and he said that he could grab some clothing from his washing line in his back garden, for he lived next door to him. He washed and put his clothes on the line the same time every week. That was the day after tomorrow, and that was 3 days before he was going to confront his friend. A couple of days later, the friends met up at George's flat, and Kevin had with him a sock of Nick's, who was the bully, and he handed it over to him. He drew a symbol of a 5-star pentacle on the floor, in what he proclaimed was cat's blood, of which he had sacrificed earlier, and he placed black candles around it. He took Nick's sock and he bound it with a piece of paper with the name of a demon on it, and he placed it at the center of the portal. He then got Kevin and a few of his friends that he had brought along with him for comfort to form a circle around the symbol on the floor, and then he got them to chant with him a conjuring spell to call up a demon who would curse Nick and bring him harm. They burnt the sock and placed the ashes on the floor in the center of the portal, and they took turns as they sipped wine mixed with cat's blood from a chalice. They asked for the demon to appear in corporeal form and to do for them their evil deed by bringing Nick to his knees, or to his demise. It was then that a strange, majestic smoke began to rise from the floor, and a figure of a demon appeared, and it asked what they wanted of him. They expressed their desires, and the demon gave the affirmation that it would do what he had been willed to do, if it could stay in the flat after he was done. They agreed, and then he vanished. George was happy with the event and the would-be result, and he closed the circle and blew the candles out and packed everything away. His friends and he then called it a night, and everyone left the flat, and they all went home thinking that that was a job well done. When they all got together once more, they were all in shock, for they had all heard that Nick had had a heart attack and had died the previous night, with a look of complete and utter terror on his face. They were ambivalent at the result, however. In the end they all decided that that was what they had intended, and that their young friend was no longer in danger. So all in all it was a good result. As time went by, the friends all got on with their lives, and then World War II broke out, and they all enlisted into separate forces to fight the Nazis. Unfortunately, the flat was now being possessed by an evil demon, because that was the deal that was made, even though George was long gone. It was this particular demon that was at the root of the haunting, and in order to clear the flat of present and future spiritual turmoil, the demon had to be expelled. The medium thanked his guide, and then he went into a deeper state of trance, and the demon possessed him, and he began to growl and curse aloud, and his eyes rolled back, as if he were looking into the back of his head. His whole body began to jerk, thrust and convulse, and his semblance began to take on a darkness that seemed to stem and portentously ooze from his whole being. Everybody was terrified by the dark entity that had entered the circle and had possessed the healer. The helper began to converse with the entity that had possessed the medium by asking it its name. If she got its name, they could have power over it. The entity said that it had no name, and that it was going to kill them all, in a dark demonic voice. She probed its mind with her own innate psychic abilities, and after a struggle, and some dark demonic mind games that the demon teased her with, the dark entity finally gave up its name. Having the name, she spat it out in contempt as she told it that it had no power over them, that its ambitions were futile, that it was not welcome, and that it should go back from whence it had come before it entered this world. In response, the healer twisted in pain and anguish as the demonic entity tried to regain superiority. However, it had lost the upper hand and was no longer in control, having relinquished its name. She then began to chant an intercessory prayer, and she sprinkled holy water onto the medium as she chanted the ritual that was devised and used to ward off evil and negative spirits, by invoking God to help them with their battle by entering the flat and cast them out. It was then that the room began to erupt once more into a chaotic turmoil as the lights began to flicker on and off, furniture began to move about chaotically and with great force. Everyone present, all except the medium and the helper, were concerned that they could all be in peril. Still, she carried on with her prayer, and the medium twisted and groaned aloud for what seemed like an eternity, in what could only have been a few minutes. Then the demon let out an awful death-defying submissive yell, as it was torn from the body of the medium, and was pulled into a spiritual vortex that had opened up in front of them at the center of their circle, where the original 5-star pentagon had been painted onto the floor in blood. As it reached its epicenter, a group of dark demonic hands grasped the shadow figure's legs, and they began to pull it into hell. The demon tried to resist, and the spiritual battle lasted for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, until eventually the dark spirit was defeated, as it was literally dragged back into hell, kicking and screaming as he went. It was then that the healer's eyes returned to a natural state, and then everything fell silent, and the furniture that had been chaotically moving all about the room came to a halt. Finally, after an epic spiritual battle, the demon had eventually and successfully been banished from the premises. It was when the healer regained his composure that the house took on a more tranquil state, and everybody was relieved as they bathed in the ambience and the peace that came in the demon's wake. Then, suddenly the darkness that had been emanating from the flat disappeared, and it became visibly brighter, as the sunlight shone in through the windows, greeting everybody that was present with a brighter, shinier new day. The spirit of Emily came back into the room and entered the medium, and she said that the house was clear of all the negative spirits, bar a few negative residual energies that still resided there, and so she was certain that Charlie was now safe to be left alone without her protection, and that she could now return to the light and get on with her afterlife unperturbed. The helper then thanked her for her service to the child and her confirmation that the evil spirits had gone, and then bid her farewell. With that, the medium's face glowed as a transfiguration occurred, where he resonated with spirit for a while, and after a short spell he finally came out of trance. Then they were all ready for closure. After the seance was complete, the medium got them to break the magic circle. Then he burnt some sage smudge sticks to clear the negative residue that still resided there, and the helper sprinkled more holy water ritualistically onto the floor to sanctify the place. Then, once they had finished their cleansing, they put out the white candles and gathered the incense burner and put them together in a container, put the lid on and put away what was left of the holy water. Then they gathered up their crystals and put them in a silk black pouch, and they put everything into a hold-all, along with the salt, bid them good night, and vacated the flat, satisfied at a job well done. In time, Susan and Stephen got over their ghostly experience, and they rebuilt their lives together. Stephen put together his own plumbing business, and Susan became the secretary and telephonist. They were very successful, and from that success they got married, got a mortgage, and bought a 5-bedroom house in suburbia in a neighboring town called Marshfield, 23 miles up the road. They went on to have 3 more children, and they all lived in peace and harmony away from harm. And as far as I know, they still do, although I am sure that the memories of the haunting still plague their minds on a subconscious level even to this day, and probably will well into their futures.